Picture a world where the line between magic and science was blurred, where scholars whispered of turning lead into gold and unlocking the secrets of immortality. But beneath the surface, these experiments held a far more dangerous power. Alchemy wasn't just about chasing riches or eternal life. It was a quiet revolution, a science so threatening that kings and popes feared its practitioners as much as they coveted their knowledge. Take Roger Bacon, the brilliant Franciscan friar whose experiments in optics and chemistry landed him in prison, accused of spreading dangerous knowledge. Why? Because alchemy didn't just promise gold, it promised the power to upend the very foundations of authority. For centuries, we've dismissed alchemy as mere pseudoscience, the misguided ancestor of modern chemistry. But hidden in coded manuscripts and forbidden texts lies a darker truth. Alchemists weren't just dreamers, they were political operatives working in shadowy laboratories that doubled as war rooms. Their symbols weren't just recipes for elixirs, they were blueprints for rebellion, encrypted messages that challenged the divine right of kings and the infallibility of the church. Imagine a world where a single formula could undermine a throne, where the quest for the Philosopher's Stone was also a quest to dismantle the pillars of medieval power. How did this happen, and why have these stories been erased from history? This is the untold saga of alchemy's secret war against authority. From the persecuted scholars who risked everything to spread their ideas, to the coded symbols that hid heresy in plain sight, we're about to unravel how the search for hidden knowledge became a weapon. You'll discover how laboratories buzzed with more than just chemical reactions. They were hubs of political intrigue, where the right discovery could topple empires. By the end, you'll see alchemy not as a failed science, but as a silent force that shaped the course of history. So let's step into the shadows and uncover the dangerous truths that once made alchemists the most feared and influential figures of their age. The story of alchemy as forbidden knowledge begins not in medieval Europe but centuries earlier, in the workshops of ancient Alexandria and the bustling libraries of Baghdad. Long before it reached the courts of kings, this art thrived where cultures collided, where Egyptian metallurgy met Greek philosophy and Persian astrology. The legendary Emerald Tablet, attributed to the mythical Hermes Trismegistus, contained ideas so radical they would unsettle Europe for 1,000 years. As above, so below, it proclaimed, suggesting the cosmos and Earth were mirrors of one another. To medieval church authorities, this wasn't just science, it was heresy. If humans could decode nature's secrets, what stopped them from challenging heaven's hierarchy? When Arabic alchemical texts reached Spain in the 12th century, they carried more than formulas for transmutation. They brought a worldview where nature operated by knowable laws, not divine whim, that terrified the powers of medieval Christendom. In 1299, the Archbishop of Tarragona ordered every Arabic manuscript on alchemy burned, not because they failed to work, but because they worked too well. These texts suggested the universe ran on principles any scholar could master, eroding the Church's monopoly on truth. Even the Vatican's own scholars secretly pored over smuggled copies, torn between fascination and fear. Yet suppression only fueled curiosity. By the 1400s, alchemists had become the most sought after and watched figures in Europe. A prince might hire one to fill his coffers with gold, but behind closed doors, they whispered of grander ambitions. The real Philosopher's Stone wasn't just a substance, it was the idea that knowledge could break chains. When the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II filled his Prague castle with alchemists, he wasn't just chasing riches. He was playing with fire, gambling that their art could give him power beyond the Pope's reach. Every alembic bubbling in those hidden labs posed a silent question. If base metal could become gold, what else might be transformed? To the untrained eye, alchemical manuscripts looked like fantastical nonsense, dragons swallowing their tails, kings dissolving in acid, suns and moons locked in celestial marriage. But these weren't just whimsical doodles. They were a carefully constructed language of rebellion, a way for alchemists to smuggle dangerous ideas under the noses of kings and inquisitors. Take the Rosarium Philosophorum, a 15th century text filled with bizarre illustrations of crowned figures dying and resurrecting. On the surface, it depicted the purification of metals. But look closer and you'll see a scathing critique of papal authority, each chemical wedding mirroring the corruption and renewal of the Church itself. One French alchemist took this subterfuge even further. Writing under the pseudonym Basil Valentine, he embedded anti-monarchy screeds within seemingly innocent recipes. His instructions for creating the Philosopher's Stone included veiled references to overthrowing tyrants, comparing the purification process to stripping corrupt rulers of their power. Authorities who intercepted these texts saw only obscure chemical formulas, missing the revolutionary subtext hidden in plain sight. That was the genius of alchemical symbolism. It was a code only the initiated could crack, making persecution nearly impossible. This double language gave alchemists extraordinary freedom. While other dissidents faced execution, they could openly publish their critiques disguised as scientific treatises. A dragon devouring its own tail might symbolize the cyclical nature of political oppression. A lion dissolving in acid could represent the dissolution of feudal hierarchies. Even the iconic hermaphrodite figures, blending male and female, subtly challenged rigid social orders enforced by church doctrine. The very ambiguity that made alchemy seem harmless to outsiders was its greatest weapon. But who truly mastered this art of subversion? Who pushed the boundaries beyond symbolism into outright defiance? The answer lies not in the laboratories of cautious scholars, but in the daring acts of figures who turned coded rebellion into open confrontation, individuals willing to risk everything to prove that knowledge, once unleashed, could shatter even the most unshakable throne. Among the most dangerous alchemists were those who wore no hoods or robes of their trade, those who moved through royal courts not as scholars but as spies. Take John Dee, Queen Elizabeth I's personal advisor, who traveled Europe under the guise of studying ancient manuscripts while secretly mapping networks of Protestant dissent. His library at Mortlake wasn't just a collection of esoteric texts. It was a clearinghouse for intelligence where alchemical symbols masked reports on Catholic troop movements and coded letters to rebel factions. To monarchs, Dee's knowledge of celestial navigation and cryptography made him indispensable. To the underground networks he nurtured, he was something far more subversive, a conduit for ideas that could destabilize empires. The Habsburgs understood this power better than most. By the 1500s, their dynasty had turned alchemy into a weapon of statecraft, employing adepts to infiltrate rival courts with gifts of poisoned gold, literally transmuting the pursuit of wealth into assassination. One notorious case involved a Spanish alchemist sent to the French court, whose success in producing gold ingots left half the Valois nobility dead from arsenic-laden metal. Yet for every alchemist working for crowns, there were a dozen working against them. In Bohemia, radical printers used the cover of alchemical workshops to produce pamphlets arguing for peasant rights, their pages mixed among harmless recipes for tinctures. A single batch of medicine might contain instructions for dyeing fabric or for making gunpowder. What made these networks possible were tools straight from the alchemist's bench. Invisible inks derived from gallnut extracts or lemon juice let messages appear only when heated, while complex ciphers disguised sedition as chemical equations. The most ingenious system used musical notation, where notes corresponded to elements on the periodic table. A melody might sound like a courtly tune but carry instructions for refining saltpeter. Even the humble alembic played its part. Glass vessels designed for distillation could also steam open sealed letters without detection. For every innovation the authorities devised to track dissent, alchemists devised 3 more to evade it. This shadow war reached its peak in the late 1600s, when a single alchemical text could spark riots from London to Vienna. The real philosopher's stone, it seemed, wasn't a substance at all. It was the knowledge that no throne was unshakable, and no authority could forever suppress the tools of its own undoing. And as empires scrambled to control the flow of alchemical secrets, they failed to notice an even greater threat brewing. The moment when these hidden networks would stop undermining thrones and start building new worlds in their place. Gold wasn't just a metal to medieval rulers, it was the lifeblood of their power, the foundation of armies, the fuel for wars and palaces, and that's exactly why alchemists targeted it. Behind the smokescreen of transmutation, some of history's most cunning operators turned gold into a weapon of economic sabotage. Take the case of Edward II of England, whose court alchemist, Raymond of Toulouse, promised to fill the royal treasury with endless gold. What followed wasn't prosperity, but chaos. Raymond's success came not from turning lead into gold, but from secretly debasing the kingdom's coinage with cheap alloys. As counterfeit coins flooded markets, prices spiraled, trust in the crown crumbled, and rebellions erupted. The alchemist hadn't just fooled a king, he'd weaponized inflation to weaken an entire regime. But the real masters of this financial alchemy weren't lone practitioners, they were banking dynasties like the Fuggers of Augsburg. While publicly dismissing alchemy as superstition, the Fuggers quietly employed adepts to manipulate Europe's debt markets. Their alchemists didn't just counterfeit gold, they perfected techniques for refining silver ore, giving the Fuggers control over the currency supply. When kings borrowed to fund their wars, it was often with Fugger-mined silver, and when those loans came due, the bankers demanded concessions that stripped monarchs of their autonomy. The Fuggers' greatest trick, convincing rulers that alchemy was a mystical pursuit while using its principles to build the first modern financial empire. The irony was devastating. Monarchs who sought to monopolize gold found their economies hijacked by the very science they'd hoped to exploit. In Spain, the flood of New World gold, combined with alchemical counterfeiting, triggered such rampant inflation that the once mighty empire teetered on bankruptcy. Even the Vatican wasn't immune when Pope John XXII condemned alchemy in 1317. It wasn't just out of theological concern. His decree followed the discovery that counterfeit gold florins, likely produced by renegade alchemists, had infiltrated church coffers, undermining the papacy's financial credibility. Yet the true danger of alchemy went deeper than economics. Its spiritual promises made it doubly threatening. While kings fretted over fake gold, alchemists like Paracelsus preached that inner transformation mirrored metallic transmutation. If a soul could be refined like base metal, what need was there for priestly intercession? This fusion of material and mystical rebellion made alchemy impossible to fully suppress. A monarch might arrest a counterfeiter, but how could he imprison an idea? That both wealth and salvation lay not in divine right, but in knowledge anyone could pursue. The alchemists' most subversive revelation wasn't in their crucibles, but in their philosophy. That power, like metal, was never as solid as it seemed. The philosopher's stone wasn't just a legend, it was a direct challenge to the divine right of kings. In a world where monarchs claimed their authority came from God, the very idea that perfection could be manufactured in a laboratory struck at the heart of their legitimacy. If an alchemist could create a substance that purified both metals and souls, what did that say about the flaws of rulers who insisted they were divinely appointed? Paracelsus, the radical Swiss alchemist, took this idea even further. He didn't just describe the stone as a physical object. He called it a symbol of spiritual and social transformation, accessible to anyone bold enough to seek it. Nature leaves nothing unfinished, he wrote, suggesting that even the lowliest peasant held the potential for refinement. To nobles clinging to hereditary privilege, this wasn't just philosophy, it was treason. A 15th century bishop saw the danger clearly. In a furious letter to the Pope, he warned that alchemists who claimed to master the stone were really teaching rebellion. He who masters the stone masters the people, he wrote, recognizing that the real threat wasn't counterfeit gold, but counterfeit authority. If perfection could be achieved through knowledge rather than birthright, the entire feudal order trembled. The Church moved swiftly to suppress these ideas, burning texts and imprisoning alchemists not for failing to make gold, but for succeeding too well at making heretics. In Vienna, authorities uncovered a clandestine network of alchemists distributing pamphlets that compared the philosopher's stone to the true equality of souls, a direct assault on the aristocracy's claim to superiority. The backlash was brutal. In 1484, King Ferdinand of Naples ordered the public execution of an alchemist named Abramlin, not for fraud, but for teaching that the stone reveals all men as equal before nature's laws. His death sent a chilling message. Questioning the divine hierarchy was as dangerous as poisoning a king. Yet persecution only drove these ideas underground, where they festered like a chemical reaction waiting for the right catalyst. By the time the Enlightenment dawned, the philosopher's stone had morphed into something even more subversive, not just a tool for personal transformation, but a blueprint for challenging the very idea that power belonged only to those anointed by God. The alchemist's greatest experiment wasn't turning lead into gold, it was turning skepticism into revolution. In 1317, Pope John XXII issued a decree that would change the course of alchemy forever. The papal bull Spondent Pariter didn't just condemn the practice, it equated alchemy with witchcraft, declaring that anyone who claimed to transmute metals was guilty of fraud or heresy. But this wasn't just about theology. The Church had glimpsed the terrifying truth. Alchemy wasn't merely a science of metals, but a science of power. If men could alter the very fabric of matter, what stopped them from altering the fabric of society? The crackdown was swift and brutal. Among its most famous victims was Jean de Roquetelade, a Franciscan alchemist whose real crime wasn't his experiments but his prophecies. In his writings, he dared to predict the Church's collapse, describing a future where corrupt clergy would fall to a purified order of spiritual adepts, a vision that echoed the alchemical process itself. Stripped of his robes and tortured in the dungeons of Avignon, Roquetelade refused to recant. His defiance turned him into a martyr for underground circles, where his prophecies were copied and circulated like forbidden currency. The irony was palpable. The Church's persecution only proved his point about its corruption. Yet even as authorities tightened their grip, alchemy flourished in the shadows. In Germany, guilds of alchemists transformed into secret societies, meeting in cellars under the guise of trade associations. Their rituals weren't just about chemistry, they were acts of resistance. Initiates swore oaths on texts hidden behind false cabinet panels, and workshops doubled as printing presses for anti-clerical pamphlets. One guild in Nuremberg went so far as to encode their meetings as merchant gatherings, using ledgers filled with alchemical symbols to record membership rolls. To outsiders, it looked like commerce. To members, it was a silent rebellion. The harder the Inquisition pressed, the more alluring alchemy became. Banned texts circulated in disguise, with incendiary passages hidden inside innocuous recipes for dyes or medicines. A manual on distilling rosewater might contain encrypted instructions for making ink that vanished when heated, perfect for smuggling messages. Persecution didn't extinguish alchemy, it refined it, distilling the movement down to its most radical elements. By the time the 1500s arrived, these underground networks had become something far more dangerous, the blueprint for revolutions to come. The alchemists had learned their greatest lesson, that suppression was just another ingredient in the process of transformation. When the German Peasants' War erupted in 1524, it wasn't just pitchforks and torches that fueled the rebellion, it was alchemical symbolism. Radical pamphlets circulating among the rebels didn't call for mere tax reforms. They spoke of the philosopher's stone as a tool to transmute society itself. One incendiary tract, The Spiritual Alchemy of the Common Man, depicted feudal lords as base metals to be purified in the fires of revolution. Its anonymous author didn't just borrow alchemical imagery, they inverted it. Where kings saw the stone as a way to amass wealth, peasants saw it as proof that even the lowliest could achieve perfection. No one weaponized this idea more fiercely than Thomas Müntzer, the firebrand preacher who turned alchemy into a battle cry. In his sermons, he likened the rebellion to the alchemical process. Peasants were the raw material, suffering the blackening of oppression, soon to emerge resurrected in a new order. The stone is not in your crucibles, he thundered, but in your hands when you grasp the sword of justice. Müntzer's genius lay in making esoteric symbols visceral. When he described princes as dross to be skimmed from the melting pot, even illiterate field hands understood the call to action. Authorities quickly recognized the threat. After crushing the revolt, they made sure Müntzer's execution was as symbolic as his rhetoric beheaded, his body displayed like a failed experiment gone awry. Yet the backlash revealed the elite's deepest fear, that alchemy's language couldn't be controlled. In the aftermath of the Münster Rebellion, where radical Anabaptists briefly established a commune, panic spread that alchemists had engineered the uprising. A captured rebel's confession, likely extracted under torture, claimed they'd used alchemical powders to embolden fighters. The real powder was metaphorical, subversive ideas distilled into pamphlets disguised as recipe books. One surviving fragment, The Poor Man's Mercury, mixed instructions for distilling alcohol with coded passages praising communal ownership of land. To authorities, this was proof of a conspiracy. Dozens were burned as alchemist agitators, though most had never touched a crucible. Their true crime wasn't fake gold, it was teaching that transformation was possible. This duality, was the stone a chemical substance or a political metaphor, haunted the movement. Some rebels carried vials of red powder, swearing it was the true stone that would protect them in battle. Others saw it purely as an emblem, like the radical printer who stamped pamphlets with a lion, symbolizing the people dissolving a crown in acid. The ambiguity was deliberate. By keeping the stone's meaning fluid, alchemy became a mirror for each rebel's aspirations. But the rebellion's failure forced a reckoning. Surviving alchemists realized open revolt was suicide. Instead, they infiltrated where authority was most vulnerable, the universities. By 1550, half the medical faculties in Germany quietly taught Paracelsian alchemy, its focus on empirical observation subtly undermining church dogma. A student learning to distill medicines might also absorb the idea that nature, not scripture, held ultimate truth. The stone's legacy lived on, not in armed revolt, but in the quiet corrosion of old certainties. One professor's lecture notes put it plainly: to purify metals is to ask why men cannot likewise be refined. The answer would echo far beyond the laboratory. By the 1400s, Europe's universities had become powder kegs disguised as centers of learning. Behind the soaring Gothic arches of Oxford and Paris, scholars weren't just debating Aristotle, they were perfecting what authorities called tyrannicide by chemistry. Ramon Llull, the enigmatic Catalan philosopher, didn't just teach alchemy at the University of Paris. He allegedly demonstrated how the right mixture of salts could mimic divine miracles, undermining the Church's monopoly on the supernatural. His real crime: drafting manuscripts that framed alchemy as a tool for moral purification, arguing that if metals could be perfected, so too could corrupt rulers. When whispers spread that his students were testing these ideas on lead figurines shaped like kings, the backlash was swift. Cambridge's ban on alchemical lectures in 1390 wasn't about academic discipline, it was survival. University chancellors had watched in horror as students, inspired by alchemical metaphors of transformation, began demanding reforms to the feudal system. One incendiary pamphlet circulating among scholars compared the university itself to an alembic, where base social orders would be distilled into something new. The irony was exquisite. Monarchs who funded these institutions to train loyal bureaucrats were now terrified of the very knowledge they'd sponsored. King Henry IV of England went so far as to station spies in Oxford's chemistry labs, not to steal secrets, but to ensure no one was teaching that sovereignty, like lead, was mutable. Yet attempts to muzzle these ideas only forced them underground, where they spread like a slow-burning fuse. Disgruntled scholars smuggled alchemical texts out of lecture halls and into the workshops of apothecaries and metalworkers. A Cambridge dropout named Thomas Norton took this knowledge to Bristol's guilds, where his Ordinal of Alchemy, ostensibly a poetic manual, contained veiled instructions for organizing artisan uprisings. Authorities missed the subtext, but guild members didn't. By the time the printing press arrived in the 1500s, these once hidden ideas were ready to explode beyond university walls. Printers became alchemy's new apostles, turning coded manuscripts into mass-produced manifestos. A single press in Strasbourg churned out hundreds of copies of the Rosary of the Philosophers, its allegorical illustrations of dissolving kings now reaching far beyond elite circles. Even more dangerous were the cheap, crudely printed pamphlets that stripped away alchemy's esoteric veneer. One notorious woodcut showed a peasant stoking a furnace labeled "The People's Wrath," while nobles melted like impurities in a crucible. What kings had feared for centuries, that alchemy's language of transformation would weaponize the masses, was no longer a nightmare. It was rolling off the presses by the thousands, inked in the same black and white as the truth it proclaimed. No authority was fireproof. The printing press didn't just mass-produce books, it weaponized alchemy. When Gutenberg's invention reached Mainz in the 1450s, one of the first works smuggled onto its presses wasn't a Bible, but an incendiary alchemical manual, the Buch der Heiligen Dreifaltigkeit, or Book of the Holy Trinity. To church censors flipping through its pages, it appeared harmless, just another mystical treatise filled with colorful diagrams of celestial spheres and chemical processes. But hidden in those intricate illustrations lay something far more dangerous. The book's central diagram, showing a king dissolving in a flask while commoners stirred the vessel, wasn't just alchemical instruction, it was Republican propaganda disguised as science. Copies spread through Europe like wildfire, passed hand to hand by merchants, monks, and disaffected nobles who recognized its subversive potential. Here was proof that the printed word could do what no army had achieved: make sedition look like scholarship. Martin Luther's reformers seized on this tactic with brutal efficiency. When Lutheran pamphleteers needed a way to attack papal authority without outright blasphemy, they turned to alchemical metaphors. One notorious woodcut circulating in 1522 depicted the Pope as a false alchemist, his triple crown melting in a crucible labeled Scripture alone. The message was unmistakable. Just as lead could be purified into gold, so too could corrupt doctrine be refined back to apostolic truth. What made these attacks so effective was their plausible deniability. Church authorities couldn't ban every allegorical text without appearing tyrannical, so the metaphors multiplied. A Basel printer even risked his life by binding Lutheran tracts inside alchemical manuals, knowing inquisitors would overlook the scientific outer layer. Princes scrambled to contain the damage. In 1545, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V issued an edict requiring all alchemical books to bear the imperial seal, not to curb fraud, but to intercept coded dissent. His agents scoured printers' workshops, confiscating anything with suspect imagery, yet the crackdown backfired spectacularly. By driving production underground, it created a black market for forbidden texts. Printers in Strasbourg began hiding anti-Habsburg messages in the margins of innocuous-looking distillation manuals, using ink that only appeared when brushed with vinegar. One surviving copy of the 12 Keys of Basil Valentine contains marginal notes praising Hungarian rebels, visible only under ultraviolet light, a trick centuries ahead of its time. The most audacious counterstroke came from an unlikely source, the aristocracy itself. Realizing they couldn't suppress alchemy's spread, powerful families like the Medici and the Fuggers attempted to co-opt it. Cosimo de' Medici established Florence's first public alchemical academy in 1560, not to pursue gold, but to monitor and sanitize its teachings. Patronage became control. By funding lavish alchemical projects, elites could steer practitioners away from dangerous ideas. When Rudolf II turned Prague Castle into a gilded cage for Europe's greatest alchemists, he wasn't just indulging a hobby. He was running the Renaissance equivalent of a surveillance state where every experiment served the crown. Yet for all their efforts, rulers failed to grasp alchemy's core lesson: knowledge once liberated couldn't be rebottled. The very presses they'd tried to regulate were now churning out works like The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, its allegory of spiritual equality circulating from Lisbon to Krakow. What began as a trickle of coded dissent had become a flood, and the revolution it foretold wouldn't stay metaphorical forever. As alchemical symbols leaped from parchment to protest banners in the 1700s, authorities would learn too late that the most volatile substance wasn't in the crucible, but in the minds of those who decoded its meaning. Henry VIII's solution to the alchemy problem was as blunt as his axe: if you can't beat them, license them. In 1543, the Tudor king issued royal charters to approved alchemists, granting them monopolies on transmutation in exchange for splitting any profits with the crown. It was a desperate gamble to transform this underground science into a revenue stream while keeping its practitioners on a short leash. The scheme backfired spectacularly. Within months, courtiers whispered that the king's own royal alchemists were circulating subversive texts among London's guilds, their coded recipes comparing Henry's break with Rome to the separation of gold from dross. One particularly brazen adept even presented the king with a gilded lead cup, a not-so-subtle jab at the monarch's habit of plating hollow promises with divine right. Across Europe, monarchs fared no better. The Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II turned Prague Castle into a glittering prison for Europe's greatest alchemical minds, hoping lavish patronage would keep their dangerous ideas contained. Instead, his court became a pressure cooker of dissent. Behind gilded laboratory doors, the emperor's pet alchemists distilled more than elixirs. They forged connections with radical Protestant networks, using chemical shipments to smuggle banned literature. One of Rudolf's own physicians, the infamous Mikkel Sedzewaj, published treatises arguing that political corruption, like impure metals, required violent purification. By the time Rudolf realized his court had become the epicenter of the rebellion he feared, it was too late. His own alchemists had perfected their greatest trick, turning imperial patronage into revolutionary fuel. No ruler embodied the absurdity of this struggle more than Charles VI of France. Convinced alchemy could protect him from assassins, he drank fortified wine laced with gold chloride, a potion his court alchemists swore would make him invulnerable. The only thing it fortified was his paranoia. When Charles died raving in 1422, his body reportedly refused to decompose for weeks, preserved by the very toxins meant to save him. The lesson was clear: those who tried to harness alchemy often became its victims. Yet some monarchs played the game with chilling precision. Catherine de' Medici turned alchemy's dark arts into statecraft, employing Italian adepts to craft undetectable poisons for her political rivals. Her secret laboratory in the Louvre perfected arsenic, laded perfumes and gilded chocolates that eliminated enemies without a trace. But even Catherine couldn't control the knowledge she weaponized. When her poisons were used against her own sons, she learned the hard way that alchemical secrets, once unleashed, recognized no loyalties. The bitter irony was this: every attempt to control alchemy only accelerated its spread. Licensing created hierarchies of approved practitioners whose very legitimacy made their ideas harder to suppress. Patronage gave radicals access to royal libraries and international networks. Even poisoning campaigns backfired as fleeing alchemists carried their knowledge into exile. By the dawn of the scientific revolution, the question wasn't whether authority could tame alchemy. It was how much of modern science owed its birth to this rogue tradition. From Paracelsus's pharmacy to Newton's optics, the tools that built the modern world were forged in the same fires that once threatened to burn thrones to ash. The alchemists' final revenge, watching the very powers that persecuted them adopt their methods, while their most dangerous idea, that knowledge breaks chains, outlasted every empire that tried to contain it. By the time Isaac Newton began filling his notebooks with alchemical symbols in the 1600s, the old art had already begun its greatest transmutation, from occult rebellion into the foundation of modern science. The same man who formulated the laws of gravity spent more time decoding the Emerald Tablet than writing the Principia, convinced that ancient alchemists had glimpsed truths about the universe that Aristotle missed. Newton's secret manuscripts, suppressed for centuries after his death, reveal a startling truth. The scientific revolution wasn't just inspired by alchemy, it was its direct descendant. His experiments with prismatic light grew from Paracelsus's work on quintessences, while his theories of atomic attraction echoed alchemical concepts of sympathetic magnetism. When the Royal Society dismissed these pursuits as embarrassing mysticism, they missed the point. Newton wasn't abandoning reason. He was extending the alchemist's most radical idea, that nature's laws could defy both church dogma and academic tradition. This tension exploded during the French Revolution, when Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, met the same fate as the alchemists he'd supposedly supplanted. Charged with tax fraud by revolutionary tribunals in 1794, his real crime was his ties to the aristocratic establishment. As the guillotine fell, it completed a grim irony. The man who debunked the Philosopher's Stone was executed for the same economic crimes medieval adepts had once been accused of. The revolutionaries who condemned him were unknowingly repeating history, proving that the line between alchemical heresy and scientific dissent had always been thinner than anyone admitted. Yet alchemy's spirit survived in Enlightenment empiricism itself. The Royal Society's motto nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it, could have been lifted straight from Roger Bacon's 13th century protests against blind faith. When Galileo insisted on observing Jupiter's moons rather than accepting church doctrine, he was channeling the same defiant curiosity that drove alchemists to test their theories in crucibles rather than scripture. The difference lay only in methodology, not motive. Both movements shared a core belief that truth wasn't handed down by authorities but forged through experimentation. Modern conspiracy theories unwittingly inherit this anti-establishment legacy, though stripped of its rigor. The same instinct that led alchemists to distrust royal proclamations now fuels skepticism of government health guidelines. Online forums dissect pharmaceutical patents like medieval adepts passing Basil Valentine's coded recipes, searching for hidden truths behind corporate jargon. Parallels are uncanny. Where alchemists once saw papal decrees as smokescreens for power, today's digital dissenters view mainstream science as another veil for control. The crucial difference: alchemists tested their doubts in laboratories, while their ideological descendants often reject experimentation altogether. What survives is the old art's most potent distillation, the conviction that knowledge belongs not to kings or institutions, but to anyone willing to question, test, and think. From Newton's clandestine alchemy to the open-source science movements of today, that disruptive spark still burns. The real philosopher's stone was never a physical object. It was the unshakable idea that no authority, whether crown or corporation, gets to monopolize the truth. Alchemy's greatest paradox was that it served both kings and revolutionaries simultaneously, a tool of control and its unraveling. Monarchs harnessed it to mint counterfeit coins and brew poisons, only to find their own courts infiltrated by adepts who whispered of equality in chemical metaphors. The same science that promised eternal wealth to emperors also armed peasants with the language to demand justice. This duality echoes in every modern debate over forbidden knowledge, from governments racing to regulate artificial intelligence to garage biohackers decoding genomes in their basements. The pattern is ancient. Authorities declare certain ideas too dangerous for the public, not because they don't work, but because they work too well. Consider the alchemist's furnace, a mirror for today's laboratories. When medieval church officials burned manuscripts on transmutation, they feared more than heresy. They feared a world where knowledge wasn't doled out by priests, but seized by anyone with a crucible and courage. Fast forward to 21st century headlines, where crypto-anarchists deploy encryption as their own philosopher's stone, turning data into a currency beyond state control. Or witness the panic when citizen scientists publish gene editing techniques online, making what was once the domain of elite institutions accessible with a homemade CRISPR kit. The stakes change, but the battle remains the same. Who decides what knowledge is safe? A Spanish alchemist awaiting execution in 1521 scribbled a final truth in the margins of his confiscated manuscript: "Fire cannot cleanse truth." His words outlived the Inquisition, just as Galileo's forbidden astronomy outlasted his house arrest, and just as today's suppressed research on climate or contagions inevitably surfaces. The irony is that suppression never extinguishes ideas, it refines them, distilling them into purer, more potent forms. When the Catholic Church banned alchemy, it didn't disappear. It went underground, resurfacing centuries later in the laboratories of Newton and the manifestos of Enlightenment thinkers. So who gets to define science today? The answer isn't found in textbooks or government grants, but in the stubborn curiosity of those who refuse to stop questioning. Every time a teenager 3D prints a vaccine component or a programmer cracks an algorithm meant to surveil, they inherit the alchemist's mantle. The real legacy of those shadowy workshops isn't lead turned to gold. It's the unshakable conviction that knowledge belongs to those daring enough to seek it. Stay curious, subscribe to uncover more hidden histories, and remember, the next revolution might not be fought with swords, but with ideas no authority can contain.